Welcome to What Can We Learn from Hull? This webinar was written at the invitation of the RPI, that's the Regulatory Policy Institute, for their Spring 2023 conference at Westminster, and for the opening section, What Can We Learn from the Past? Kingston upon Hull, established in 1299, was a medieval new town characterised by markets and subject to a range of regulatory initiatives. This will be the scope of the talk. My name's Rob Bell. More on my background in a moment. So let's get started. Raised in Hull, I studied history and economics at St Andrews and Oxford universities, and moving on, I'm a specialist in marketing, logistics and supply chains, having worked in over 35 countries, mostly in developing markets. Recent projects include critical supply chains with the DFT, post-harvest losses in Ghana, network portals with Next Generation Manufacturing Canada, and value chain. In parallel, I'm a writer on business topics as well as poetry and plays on post-industrial themes. I'm a visiting fellow at Durham University Business School and deliver webinars and workshops for other universities and entrepreneurial networks in India and Africa. Now, back to Hull. Swerving east from rich industrial shadows and traffic all night north, the shining gull-marked mud gathers to the surprise of a large town, a cut-price crowd, urban yet simple, dwelling where only salesmen and relations come. Yep, some of you will not have been closer to Hull than a Larkin poem. That was from here. These are my roots and the topic for this webinar. The home of Wilberforce, slavery abolitionist, of the Deep, of Larkin, of Liquid Crystal, and better known perhaps since the City of Culture year of 2017. And yet, in so many ways, it is still firmly at the end of the line. And here, my task is to travel back in time to explore markets from a fresh perspective, using Hull as my vantage point. I have three key questions to address. First, structures. How did socioeconomic structures evolve? Here you can see how we start. Society is made up of three key players: those who pray, those who fight, and those who do the work. And this changes, as we'll see. Second, how did markets emerge and develop? As we'll see, there's a commercialisation of England through this period. And three, well, at an RPI conference, there's one word I ignore at my peril. Did regulation simply preside as a sanction, or did it help to shape markets? These are the three perspectives we're going to be looking at. I'll use this framework. Three sections. First, global and local context. 2, a deep dive into the market. And 3, back to the future. Mark Twain once said that history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. And here we'll explore whether this local story of a medieval new town has anything to say for today. This is a busy historical period, and to make sure that we're all roughly on the same page, we need a scaffold. We are talking Hull, 1299 to 1509, the medieval age. We'll cover three periods within. First, 1066 to 1290, the prequel, for want of a better expression, characterised by a demographic increase of 1 to 5 million. Domestic bonanza, wool, the oil of the era, was a major export, and foreign merchants dominate. 2, 1290 to 1390. This was a dramatic demographic contraction from 5 to 2 million. Europe loses 60% of its population, and demand for pretty much everything is hit. Inflation bites. By 1370, for example, 70% of court time is on labour disputes. And then 3, 1390 to 1509, a resurgence for some. I mentioned the prequel. In 1066, William had won at Hastings, and in the winter of 1069-70, he moved north to wipe out the remaining Anglo-Saxon leadership and sympathisers. Over 100,000 died during an ensuing famine, and at this stage, Hull was not even on the map. Now, to build back the economy, William positioned his own men across the north. For example, the Duc d'Aumale over in Holderness, and the Cistercians came in to build a network of fine monastic communities. They established and grew a major network of sheep-rearing grangers. This was the wool that had been insisted upon as part of the ransom for Richard Lionheart in 1194. Wool was the oil of the age, a hugely valuable commodity. And here you can see on the map, Meuse was the centre of operations, a logistics hub. Edward I had noticed that towns were profitable, generating taxes. He was attracted to Wyke, owned by the monks at Meuse, and made an offer which was accepted. He established Kingston upon Hull by 1299, and it proved useful for exports of wool, imports of wine, and as a strategic base for his Scottish wars and even the 100 Years' War to follow his reign. In his own words, the purpose of his purchase was to increase the fitness of the port for ships and traffic. But there were investments to be made. Hull was not a manufacturing centre. It was, in modern-day terms, a logistics hub. It needed investment to dredge, defend, and distribute. Edward I invested in many new towns, and he did so for reasons. History, said the great historian Braudel, is what people do with their geography, and Edward saw Hull as an ideal distribution hub in the middle of this river system. 20% of English rivers drain into the Humber estuary. When roads were either non-existent or often flooded, rivers were the real highways and could lower transaction costs. On the right, using a London Underground style map, we identify the towns that use these rivers to move their merchandise and often use Hull as a transshipment hub. Which brings us to the central place theory of Kristalla and Lersch. The central place or hub is in the middle of the hexagon, and in the case of Hull, the hinterland hexagon is one dimension. Another hexagon extends into the North Sea and lowlands, as well as the Baltics in Europe. In a sense, the nodal points are where the clusters of specialized products are located. In a nutshell, Hull was selected as a new town because of location, a location that needed investment. Edward had bought the town and invested in making it strategically capable, and saw sense in improving the hinterland as well. Beyond the walls, plots owned by the council were let at no rent save the obligation to maintain flood defence, hence a number of windmills. Draining the land was a priority during the 12th and 13th century. Dykes crisscrossing Holderness were a feature of the low-lying landscape. Flatlands, slow rivers, and grain-rich farming were ideal for another feature of the landscape. In a sense, this investment was a barrier to entry for other towns. So where are we with Hull before we assess the markets? First, as a new town, it was one of 500 by 1350, up from 120 in 1297. This meant competition. The attraction for Edward was more for trade than defence, and looking through the city archives, it's clear that Hull is led by aldermen from the merchant class. There are very few agricultural links other than to buy from, and there's a weak manufacturing base. The links are with Flanders for wool and cloth, the Baltics for timber and iron, and with Gascony for wine. One thing to note, the Baltic has a huge part in the whole story, but it was also a major constraint, freezing over for a third of the year, and hence the casual workers later to be the dockers of East Hull. We move to markets. If you were to ask people in Hull about markets, they'd take you to the indoor market, modelled on the old market by the Minster, full of stalls, just like in medieval times. If you asked about a fair, then it would be all about candy floss and the Big Dipper in October. Hull Fair is a world away these days from the trade fair it was back in the medieval age. And these days, the old fruit market, which used to be Hull's equivalent to Covent Garden before gentrification, is now full of bistros, not oranges, rather like Shoreditch. The notion of markets being the framework for an economy would not be the first response. And yet, Sen's quip could sit well with it all. To be generically against markets is like being generically against conversation. Clearly, the word market generates a multiplicity of interpretations. We need a framework. As we explore the market in medieval Hull, I'm going to borrow a framework from the great historian Fernand Braudel. In his book, The Wheels of Commerce, he likens the market to a three-storey house. First, the ground floor, the everyday economy. This is for perishables and staple crops. Hull had 2 markets per week. And in terms of regulations, it had to be licensed, and labour laws were hugely important after the Black Death, as we shall see. We then moved to floor 2, the next level, for micro-capitalism. This is where the middlemen emerge, working the annual trade fairs. Hull had one lasting 6 weeks and many foreigners attending. Some focused the local hinterland, others could be the agents of foreign merchants. And this is all about enabling market access. And that means competition and horizontal communications are needed. These people had warehouses, storage, and so on. This is also the level of civic leadership. These men coordinated policies to improve the town. However, in 1461, they took the decision in Hull to take up and sell the lead water pipes feeding the town. The council, in a simple term, was skint. And 3, we move to capitalism. This is for privileged actors and opaque networks, initially exclusively about fernhandel, which is long-distance trade. The local merchants didn't have the appetite or the capital to take such risks. Markets, as Ralph Dahrendorf puts it, were the ligatures in society, ties that bind. And this level of merchant was one such tie. This is where capitalism lives. In fact, Braudel and the economist Poliani see this as anti-market. This merchant class is international, high risk, high profits. These oligarchs had no interest in competition. They wanted monopoly. Vertical communication between these players was not a level playing field. Everyday markets were all about the trade of common, low-value, perishable goods. They remained a local affair because of the costs of transportation. Merchants had to pay tolls at certain points along the road so that only luxury goods were worth transportation over long distances. This was even more complicated in the approach roads to Hull, which were often flooded. Locally, a key dimension was reputation. Literary sources such as Piers Plowman illustrate the importance of the reputation of a town's market, good quality produce at a reasonable price. And regulation could protect against competition from other towns, their fairs and markets, and more locally, against informal hawkers. Regulation, in the shape of charters and guilds setting the standards, was the norm. Later, shops start to emerge as a serious, more permanent option for consumers. Markets decline, and fairs lose out to merchants trading all year round. I highlight on the right 3 guilds. Hull was not strong on guilds, as were other towns, because merchants held sway over agricultural landowners and manufacturers. As we've seen, guilds played a role in regulation. Here's an example for fish. Regulation occurred in two areas. First, production. In London, 1320, police inspected nets in the Thames to note the catching of immature fish, which was depleting future stocks. And then two, at the point of sale or purchase, an inspection of fish baskets in 1307 notes that they were too small and all were burned. Elsewhere, there was regulation of arrow makers making tips to inferior specifications, and this was seen as a strategic problem for the country's defence. It had to be stamped out. Regulation was a form of protectionism. Now for markets overseas. This map highlights in red the moves of Venetian merchants, purple sees the reach of the Hanseatic League, and we can see the commodities traded. Hull was North Sea and Baltics. In the early years of the port, Venetian and Florentine merchants like the Bardi traded wool. There were Gascons here for the wine trade, and there were clear networks into the Baltics for timber, iron and flax, all regulated by the Crown. Significantly, this is also how information flowed, not just merchandise. And there were risks. For example, the Hanseatic League were in control of the Baltic trade, and increasingly we see the Dutch across the North Sea as they enter their golden age. All ports are as good as the trading networks they're part of, and the strength of their trade is down to the connectedness of their merchants. And here we have William de la Pole. Hull had a merchant of their own who was regarded second to no other merchant in England. Merchants were useful financially to the king. They governed his towns, and their trade underlay foreign relations. And in the case of de la Pole, he was a source of huge loans. De la Pole was a pivotal figure in this triangular trade, and he dealt first in wool, which flowed to Flanders. Then cloth from Flanders moved to Gascony in exchange for wine, and the wine moved on to Hull. De la Pole had a hand in it all. The wine trade's instructive. With roots in Roman times, the English wine trade was well established. In the run-up to the 100 Years' War, the Edwards saw this as a bargaining chip. Offering exclusivity for wine in England, the Gascons gave loyalty to the king. This intervention closed down the English wine trade and diverted land to other crops. Regulation was being used for industrial strategy. Another example of intervention comes with timber. The surround of Hull had been wooded, but it was clear that fertile land would be best suited to arable and pastoral farming. The wood could come from the Baltics. This was a deliberate policy encouraged by the king. More tax revenue on the lands and more tax revenue on the movement of timber. For Hull, the key was trade with the North Sea and Baltics, as we've noted. There was a clear physical flow of exports, wool and lead coming from Derby, coming down by the river, and imports, factor markets such as timber and iron. The key here is that fernhandel, long-distance trade, increased risk and necessitated forms of credit. Remember, in the earlier period, usury was not condoned by the church, so all sorts of instruments emerged to circumvent the constraint. That point about loans, the Edwards had form. Here's Edward III and his loans from the Bardi in the accounts for 1338 to 1340 alone. He loaned £8,000, which today would be about 7.2 million. Then de la Pole, loans of £68,000 or £51 million today. All of this was to fund the wars. And here's the problem. The kings had a lousy record of payment. In fact, Bishop Stubbs' account makes plain that Edward III was unscrupulous and saw England, like Richard I, as no more than a source of supplies. In fact, de la Pole had to write off all of these loans just to keep his position in society. Let's not forget the state as regulator, specifically in two spheres. First, to preserve freedom, and that's A, price controls to guarantee competition, and B, taxes to invest in infrastructure and factor markets, that's timber and iron for infrastructure, which could be seen as a common good. Later, we move to 2, the state as guarantor, and this destroys freedom. A, as a guarantor of monopolies. We're going to see the East India Company at a later stage. And B, the guarantor of money. Strong currencies, the noble metals of gold and silver, against the weak, that's copper. That's the coinage for the everyday market, not covered by barter. Which brings us to money. Now, in the everyday economy, money had grown. Under William, there was about £50,000 in circulation. By 1300, we're looking at about 1 million. However, to cope with ever more trade, more sophisticated money markets were needed than could be handled by A meets B over the counter. We add fernhandel and long-distance trade, the Baltics, the North Sea, and that means risk over distance. Now, A needs C, and B needs D. For fernhandel, the top story of our house comes into play. It's all about capital, not merchandise. All 3 levels are inhabiting different spheres. The economist Poliani highlighted this shift in approach, the market economy as a competitor to the traditional transactional economy framed by local social relationships and not by anonymous bills of exchange. So far, so good. And then, out of the blue, came the black swan, or an Armageddon of black swans. This is a metaphor for a major event that comes as a shock, but later is rationalized as something that could have been prevented. There were serious famines in the first years of the 14th century. Then the Black Death struck in 1349-53 and hit most of Europe. 100 years later, we have the bullion famine, a cash flow crisis we'll cover later. How resilient were the 3 levels of market to these black swans? Population in England from 850 to 1600 looks like this, peaking at 6 million in 1300, and then collapsing with the Black Death to 3 million. And it's that demographic contraction that causes all sorts of problems in all of the markets as demand collapses. One other regulatory point, disease and public health. Simply put, the medieval trade routes on the left pinpoint the advance of the Black Death on the right, and that means that medical regulations in ports started to follow. The other area for consideration is labour and regulation. After the Black Death, less hands for the harvest and to load and unload ships. Landowners were in a panic. For example, in 1348, Ralph, Earl of Stafford, and John Gifford were paying their farm labourers 1 pence a day. By 1350, they were forced to increase it to 2 pence a day, and other local landowners were paying 3 pence a day. Landowners complained to King Edward III about having to pay these higher wages, and the landowners were also worried about the peasants roaming the country searching for better job opportunities. So the king issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, in what is seen as the beginning of English labour law. It decreed that everyone under 60 must work. Employers must not hire excess workers. Pay was to return to pre-plague levels, and food must be priced reasonably with no excess profit. Then the sumptuary laws. These prevented labourers from wearing clothes and eating foods above their station. More labour laws followed in 1360, 1388 and 1406, with stiffer penalties on rural labourers and curtailed their social and geographic mobility with harsher control. Despite the regulation, wages rose and peasants were on the move. The Black Death created a severe shortage of labour. Hull invested in cranes around 1357 to load and unload cargo. This was when the multiple landing stages on all of the rivers around the estuary gave way to port operations. This was innovation. Smaller ports could not keep up. As Professor James Belich in his groundbreaking recent book, The World the Plague Made makes plain, plague pressure-cooked a whole swathe of innovations. This is the moment Hull started to diverge on the Humber, a transshipment hub for north and south of the estuary, over to the North Sea and into the Baltics. We can see here the decline of English wool exports from a height of 40,000 sacks in 1300 to nothing by 1600. The trigger was the Black Death and a contraction in population. No one needed the wool. This was bad for Hull. Then we had the 100 Years' War and a collapse of wine imports. Again, bad for Hull. A shortage of bullion and another pressure. And then the rise of London. As Botero, the Italian writer, puts it, the greatness of a city is said to be not the largeness of the site or the circuit of the walls, but the multitude and number of the inhabitants and their power. The fact is that risks in the Baltics and the North Sea markets increase the need for working capital, and the Baltic froze over in the winter every year. We see now a shift to the Atlantic, conquest and bullion in the Americas, slaves, and a range of new products. London is on its way. Let's not forget the rise of monopolies, the East India Company, 1600, the Dutch East Indias Company just after, and Hull and the eastern English ports are now in decline as markets are transformed. Shareholders now venture the capital, merchants do the business, mariners move the merchandise, and artisans make what is needed. But they're no longer local players. We've moved from feudalism and local gentry. This is now mercantilism in full flow, making sure we control the transactions, import what we can add value to in England, and export, but not from all of the ports. As we've seen, all of these actors, market stalls and merchants, change over time. Here's a timeline with their story. Phase 1, local stalls deal with the everyday. Hull Fair is a trade fair and capital is handled by foreign merchants. Phase 2, market stalls remain, but demand falls because of famine and the Black Death. Local merchants like Delapole have influence, and there are attempts to regulate foreigners. And then Phase 3. We move to a London-dominated mercantilism. By the end of the 15th century, around 85% of trade is controlled through London. The trade fair has become a local fun fair, and local market stalls are feeling the pressure from shops. Long haul is about luxury goods, and that means novelty. Local markets are for staples. Local is open, competitive, copper coins. Higher up is high finance and paper money. Demography has driven this agenda, and London, increasingly, has the aggregate demand. This period gives us several pivotal moments. The epicenter of finance moves from Italian city-states to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, and then London. In trade terms, this sees us move from the Mediterranean to the Baltics and to the North Sea, both big markets for Hull, and then away from Hull, we move to the Atlantic. This was all about exploitation and settlement, gold bullion and slavery. To be clear, Hull's William Wilberforce was involved in abolition, but the city did not extend its trade into the Atlantic. It remained, as did Wilberforce's family, focused on the Baltics. From 1300 to 1800, England and London is on its way. Here we map GDP for 6 countries. 'Tis a busy slide, so here is the trend. From 1270 to 1800, population has multiplied by 5, GDP by 28, per capita by 5.7. And it's our view that to crowd the capitalist story into the 19th century's Industrial Revolution is a tad late. Markets arrive before the Industrial Revolution and all its factories. Don't forget, only 5% of manufacturing is in English factories by as late as 1850. Divergence with the provincial hinterland is building in the medieval age. Yes, levelling up has deep roots, and this means asymmetrical markets are emerging, very much like today's developing markets, where the bullock cart, so to speak, meets the likes of Walmart. Low-tech and subsistence meets high-tech and capital-intensive in multi-tiered supply chains. This would be worth further study. Let me give an insight on this divergence and its asymmetrical relationships. This is an extract from quite a bit of number crunching. Here we're looking at wages in England, measured in grams of silver. In 1500, that's 2.88 grams in Hull versus 3.60 in London. But by 1725, that's 6.10 in Hull, playing 10.73 in London. And that means that Hull wages have shifted from 80% of the London number to 57% of London wages. This pattern is followed with other provincial towns. Local markets simply cannot compete. More work is needed to explore how significant this divergence is for future growth. And so we close with our structures, markets and regulation slide. Structures, merchants of London are increasingly dominant on all things trade by the end of our period. Markets, largely segmented and London-centric. Hull Fair starts with trade and foreign merchants and ends with a fun fair, no place for trade. Market stalls are being replaced by more permanent shops. Fernhandel and big value consignments need more sophisticated traders with international networks. And then regulation. As an enforcer, we see this increasingly to controlling foreigners working here. And as guarantor, regulation is moving to frame monopolies. Not enough is being done to maintain the markets in places like Hull. Plus ça change. What can we learn? Well, T.S. Eliot warned against the parochialism of now. We've dipped back into the medieval age, so now it's back to the future. Medieval and modern-day Hull have much in common. Both eras are subject to frequent flooding. Resilience is needed. Both have been hit by disease and lockdowns. The Black Death forced innovation. Remember the cranes. However, have we taken the opportunity to level up with low interest rates and with remote working due to the pandemic? I think not. The pull of London remains the same, despite technology being available to close the gap. We started with Hull as a medieval new town. Looking forward, perhaps we need inspiration from the likes of Allsopp's Supercity, from the Mersey to the Humber, to face the future. As the world beefs up with ever bigger city regions, the UK has fragmented into bun fights on far too local grants. Hull happened because of scale, its hinterland and its networks, and infrastructure was invested in for the common good, where markets simply would not go. And then we have the role of the firm, and I would venture to say the market itself. Delapole made money from markets, but saw his purpose as that of a transformational entrepreneur, high on social returns on investment, investing in local infrastructure for the common good. Milton Friedman would argue that the firm and markets are morally neutral, and the sole purpose is for profit. Stakeholders versus shareholders. ECG, value versus, as Mark Carney puts it, values. And is this a role for regulation? And so to conclude, we're back at the house. It's my view that regulation throughout this story was and could have been in some instances even more than a gatekeeper. Part of the market, not of a parallel universe. And with an eye to networks today, regulation could help to maximize network benefits. On the everyday, regulation can learn from regulating medieval markets for competitive advantage. I'm thinking the informal economy in the developing world, and economist Eleanor Ostrom has much to say on this. SMEs need this as they navigate the transition to net carbon zero. And on the mini-capitalist level, much can happen with fintech to link SMEs in the provinces with overseas markets using network portals and the like. What can be learned from Germany and the Mittelstand? And finally, at the top of the house, the policy level. What about more regulatory muscle on carbon costs to accelerate the transition? After all, the Edwards made clear interventions to accelerate the transition of some sectors over others. Gone with wine, promotion of agribusiness instead. The fact is that places like Hull are fading far behind. Top right. Local boxer Tommy Coyle selling fruit from his family's market stall in Hull recently. Just the same as the everyday markets in medieval Hull. Prices are visible, purchases are physical. There's banter and people socialise, and one stall competes openly with another. We've come to see markets as disembodied, random and rather ominous forces. The labour market, the commodities market, the stock market. Financialisation has seen prices cut up and reassembled to repackage risk. These markets are opaque and edged towards monopoly. Perhaps we need to revisit the three-storied markets we've explored in medieval Hull. Back then, climate saw Hull flooded frequently, plague triggered innovation, and conflict upset long-distant markets constantly. Perhaps there are things to learn, and regulation could play a role in checking that magnetic pull of monopoly. We close with lines from Larkin's poem Money. I listen to money singing. It's like looking down from long French windows at a provincial town. The slums, the canal, the churches ornate and mad in the evening sun. It's intensely sad. And I would add, if we get these markets wrong. This has been Rob Bell, exploring the market, its structure, and the role of regulation in medieval Hull. What can we learn? This webinar is a version of a talk given at the Regulatory Policy Institute's Spring Conference at Westminster on the 19th of April, 2023. Thanks for listening.